I've been struggling with whether or not I should make this video for a while. I've gone back and forth on the pros and cons, and I've come to the conclusion that it is a valuable piece of information that I can impart to the community. And today we are discussing the current state of sword media online. If you've been on YouTube, TikTok, or any other social media platform, you probably understand that the conversation about swords and swordsmanship is mostly dominated by pop culture, fantasy, anime, video games, and things like that. And that's not necessarily bad, it's what the people want to see, but the problem is that's kind of all you can find. Yes, there are some amazing people doing some historically relevant and, tactically correct sword stuff online, but they're few and far between, and realistically, they're not very popular channels. I think that we're one of the more popular channels that does a lot of fencing stuff, and really the reason that we're popular is because we also do some of the silly stuff like memes and things like that. If we just did historical swordsmanship, we wouldn't be nearly as popular, and that's because people don't seem to find it as enjoyable as they do, anime and stuff like that. And I find that to be a shame, but that's just the way things are. But today I want to talk to you guys about what makes good sword content and who you should and shouldn't listen to and why. I don't think I need to say this, but I'm gonna say it anyway. Anime, video games, pop culture, and all of those things are not accurately representing swordsmanship. It's cool, it's fun, and it's enjoyable to watch, but that's not the way that swords would have actually been used. But because most popular content creators who do things about swords are courting that audience, they tend to couch things in terms of those anime techniques or things like that. How many videos have you seen kind of breaking down video game sword fighting and things like that? It's interesting, it's fun to watch, but the conversation is dominated by that, to the point where it's really hard to find realistic swordsmanship unless you know where to look. The other issue is that there are very few people who are popular swordsmanship creators who do a lot of fencing. And it's integral to fence to understand how these things work. Popular sword media on YouTube and other sites like it lack a true representation of the art of swordsmanship. Most of it's focused on looking cool, doing cool choreography, and there's nothing really wrong with that, like I said before, and I'm gonna say that over and over again in the video, but it is what dominates the conversation, and we really lose the reality of how these things would have worked. And I find that, honestly, the stuff that we make just to be cool isn't nearly as interesting as the stuff that is realistic, because the realistic stuff is really cool. One of the biggest problems with this is, well, it's difficult. Fencing is hard. It is a skill. It is a martial art. It is an art that we pursue through our entire lives. It's not something that you just get. And so to actually be good at fencing, you have to dedicate a lot of time to it. And if you're also a YouTuber creating a lot of content, consuming a lot of media like anime, video games, and things like that, you don't have as much time to dedicate to getting good at the real thing. And so a lot of people who are popular and making popular stuff about swordsmanship don't actually fence, and that leads to a fundamental misunderstanding of how these things work, which leads to experiments and demonstrations and videos about swords and swordsmanship that are misinformed, and not necessarily intentionally so, but they are. And the question arises, why is this important? We're not using swords to fight anymore, so why does it matter if our media and everything else is totally inaccurate? Well, the real answer is it doesn't, but it's just kind of stupid to be misinformed. I get a lot of comments in my comment section saying, so-and-so did an experiment and it proves XYZ, and when I look at the experiment, I can see all the problems with it and how it wasn't set up in such a way to accurately represent the way that these weapons would work. Maybe they were using, weapons that weren't up to snuff, maybe their technique wasn't very good, maybe they just had a misunderstanding of how fencing works, and now I have to deal with those comments. So maybe this is a selfish video. Maybe this is a video that it's my personal pet peeve. But I do believe that accurately understanding the way that swordsmanship works is valid and it's worthwhile. And it might not be crucial for every single piece of sword media to be accurate, but it's something that I think that we should understand and have a deeper, appreciation for. So I've spoken about experiments on YouTube a number of different times. There's been quite a few content creators who have tested things out. We've done it. We did the Great Reverse Grip experiment. We started to do some spinning experiments. We've done certain situational things, and we always give you kind of the way that we're testing things. Now, I admit that sometimes in the past I've done an experiment and then I've learned things later and I've gone back and corrected myself, which is crucial. If whoever you're watching is not able to correct themselves and say they were wrong when they learned something new, they're not worth watching. But a lot of these experiments that I see are done with like foam swords exclusively, or they're not geared up, or they're done in kind of situations where there's very, limited testing circumstances, or maybe they're testing for too broad of a thing. And you can kind of watch a video and if you use common sense, you can see the pitfalls of an experiment. I'm sure there's some experiments that we've done that aren't ideal. And you know, those are things I want to go back and I want to fix and I want to look at. The best experiment or exploration of the technique is done in full gear with steel swords, because that's the closest that we can get to replicating the way these things would have actually been done. When we do it in low gear or no gear or with foam swords, every single one of those is a compromise that's letting us not do this to the fullest extent that we could. For safety's sake, the performance of the weapon, or you name it, all of those things detract from the validity of an experiment that's being done. It's crucial for our viewers to be critical of the experimenter or the presenter. You shouldn't just take everything somebody says with a grain of salt, including me. I've done experiments before where maybe I didn't have the proper testing procedures, or maybe I didn't have a crucial piece of evidence or information, and that makes my experiment invalid. I can't think of any off the top of my head. I did one a while back where I said that leg hits are bad and they don't work. And then I started training with somebody who showed me exactly how you can do valid leg attacks. And so I changed my mindset and I made a video about it. I called myself out. And I've done that a number of times. And you know, anybody worth their salt should be able to do that. We did an experiment recently where we used these foam greatswords. And like I said earlier, foam is not steel. So it wasn't a completely valid experiment to show one-to-one how these things would work. But we also said that caveat in the video. From the beginning, we laid out the idea that this was not an experiment to show exactly how greatswords would have been used in crowd control. It was a thought experiment because we couldn't accurately represent how greatswords would work because it's too dangerous to fence full force with steel greatswords. So we had to make a compromise there if we wanted to do the experiment at all. When a presenter gives you that information, when they give you that caveat, you can trust them a little bit more. And I realize it might seem like I'm just talking myself up right now, but what I'm trying to do is give you a baseline of what you should expect from a valid experiment. If there are caveats or if there are restrictions to the experiment testing process, they should be stated to the viewer and not just glossed over. So how do you, the viewer, know when a presenter is worth listening to? Well, we've already talked about a couple of things, but there's some other things you should be watching for. If they're talking about how to use a sword, they should use a sword. They should fence. Not everybody has to go to a tournament and win gold to be worth listening to. I fence and train under a number of different people who don't compete in tournaments because they don't like to, but they're still amazing instructors and fencers. No, they have to do the art. If you don't do the art, you cannot talk about how to do the art. Now, there are people who are historians who don't fence, and they have valid insights about the history of these weapons, but they don't have an understanding of how they would have been used. You cannot understand how these things would have been used just by studying books. You have to pick one up and you have to do it, and preferably you should do it with steel and full gear. Now, because HEMA and fencing are not as popular as anime and fantasy and things like that, it can be hard to find legitimate swordsmen online to follow and watch content from. So I've done the work for you, and I have found a number of different channels who do awesome swordsmanship that's based in reality. These are people who actually fence, they practice the art. You can go check them out, they're awesome. And I'll say right off the bat, we're not gonna agree on everything. They might say things that contradict things that I say, and I might say things that contradict things that they say, but that doesn't make them invalid, it just means they have a different opinion. You know, they could know something that I don't know, or I can know something that they don't know. But these are legitimate fencers and they make good content, so definitely check them out. And the last thing that I want to say is, it's not bad to love fantasy and anime and video games and things like that. I love them, I play them, I watch them. And I don't even get mad when a character does reverse grip in some silly fantasy series because it's fake and it doesn't matter. The issue is people have a hard time differentiating between that fantasy and the reality of how these things would work because they just don't have enough exposure to them. But if you watch good content, you're critical of the presenter, you understand how experiments are formulated, and you check out awesome sword channels, you can learn more about how these things are actually used, and that'll lead to you enjoying swords and swords media even more.